I'm going to get personal for a minute. I'm about to spend the next several videos comparing the events in the Left Behind series with a different way of interpreting those prophecies. Now, usually when I come across biblical concepts that I disagree with, I'm perhaps a bit saltier than maybe I should be. It would be hard for me to do that here. You see, the way Left Behind interprets biblical prophecies comes from a system called dispensationalism. Specifically, it's Reformed dispensationalism. And that's a belief system popularized by this man, Dr. Charles Ryrie. I know his beliefs well. You see, I grew up with the guy. I should say I grew up with his family. His wife and my mother were best friends. His son Bruce and my brother were close. I used to love going over to the Ryrie house. They had a pool. We didn't. He passed away some years ago. I don't have any desire to tarnish his reputation. And yet, I do think dispensationalism is misguided. And I think I can show where it goes wrong. But it's going to be a little tricky. You see, as far as biblical end times prophecy goes, dispensationalism is probably as close to an orthodox view as we have. And explaining where it goes off the rails is going to mean dealing with some of the underlying assumptions that are really common to modern Christianity. As I well know, I used to do Christian apologetics, and I held beliefs just like this one. In fact, this is kind of what got me out of apologetics. I came to view the debates as a waste of time. It was just me pointing out the inconsistencies in the skeptics' beliefs, and, if they had any reasonable knowledge at all, the skeptics pointing out the inconsistencies in mine. And when it came to things like the end times prophecies, I had no answers. How does a mark on the forehead condemn someone to an eternity in hell when everything else tells us that salvation is by faith alone? How does an earthly kingdom ruled by Jesus and his apostles last 1,000 years, but collapse and then require the destruction of the entire planet? If the Bible was God's truth, then it should be without a single inconsistency. And I vowed never to argue it again until I could reconcile those inconsistencies. But, as is so often the case when something is a part of your life, in this case the apologetics, it's hard to leave it behind. It was a few years later, 2008, and the economy had just tanked. The police department where I worked had just gotten a bunch of government-issued riot gear. We were hearing rumblings about coming civil unrest, and I started thinking about this end-time stuff again. I was always an avid reader of history, and I kept running into historical events that seemed like they could be end-times prophecies, like with the first video I ever made. And I wondered if I could just sit down with the book of Revelation, maybe sketch it out. Take any passage that seemed to refer to something that had already happened, and see if I could pry out some sort of underlying theme. When I was done, I had something. It wasn't complete, but it was starting to take on shape. There were still a few questions I couldn't answer. I knew that not being able to buy or sell without the charagma, what we translate as the mark of the beast, was a reference to people of principle being ostracized. But that had never happened in the Christian West. But remember, this was 2008. It's not like there was some sort of cancel culture at work back then. And then this one really threw me. I knew that the lamb beast referred to a Jesus-like, so a martyr complex culture, a culture founded somehow on presenting itself as a victim. And I knew that the dragon beast referred to the old classical pagan style of manipulating and controlling everything you get your hands on. But I couldn't figure out how a culture founded on manipulation and control would ever subvert its own interests. Not knowingly. Not only was there no historical analogy for this, but I couldn't even picture it. Oh, how times have changed. The main thing, for me, that came out of that 2008 study was that I realized a lot of those prophecies referenced other biblical passages that I became certain focused on people's worldviews, our basic assumptions of the world and our place in it. And I became convinced that dispensationalism, which has only been around since the 1800s, was the result of the worldview that has become dominant during that time period, humanism. I'm going to talk a lot more about the worldviews as we go. For now, before I even attempt to get into the details of the movie and those prophecies, I'm going to start it all off with a kind of worldview primer. You see, we tend not to think about worldviews. Like I said, they form our basic assumptions, things we just assume are true, so things we don't usually think about. Nevertheless, having a different worldview from someone else means you can look at the same events, the same stories, even the same words, and come to two totally different conclusions as to what those things mean. So let's start with the most basic of those. Words. In this case, just one word, the word love. If you grew up in church like I did, you may have learned that we have 3 Greek words in the New Testament that we translate as the word love: eros, philos, and agape. And that eros means romantic love, philos means love that one has for a friend, and agape means God's perfect love. And if you were like me, you never even thought to question why it was that the pagan Greeks would have a word that meant God's perfect love. Well, they didn't. Here's what happened. In the time period between the writing of the Old Testament books and the New Testament, the Greek language became the lingua franca, the common language of the Mediterranean, especially for writing because it allowed for far more nuanced expression than languages like Hebrew or Aramaic. So it made sense that the New Testament books would use it. But there was a problem. Different worldviews have different concepts, because of course they do. Take love, for example. The concept, fundamentally, is the absolute best or highest state of affairs. But what is the absolute best state of affairs, state of being? Well, how you answer that question will depend on your worldview. For the pagan, which imagines a metaphysical world of small g gods, so something is out there but nothing all-powerful, the highest ideal is always going to be materialistic. Things we appreciate now in the material world, like comfort, security, pleasure, wealth, status in the community, etc. And that's what those Greek words mean. Eros means, you are useful to me sexually. Philos, which we translate as friendship, really means more like ally. Not that they couldn't be friends too, but the point is that they had common goals, like saying that they're on the same team. There was no word in ancient Greek that meant God's perfect love, or meant anything like the Hebrew words in the Old Testament that we translate as love. The main ones typically translate as something like, I am devoted to you, or I would sacrifice anything for you. I'll explain these more later. Just notice for now that the pagan concept of love is based on what something or someone can do for you, whereas the Hebrew concept of love is based on what you are willing to do for them. So, how were the Hebrews supposed to express this very alien idea using only a pagan language? Well, at the time the New Testament books were being written, the word agape was already substituting for those Hebrew words for love in Jewish communities throughout the Greco-Roman world. What does the word agape really mean? It means group meal. English translators will usually suggest the closest English equivalent is the word feast. If you read one that says love feast, they're already noting the change that took place once Judeo-Christians co-opted the word. The Greek word just meant a group of people eating together. What's the connection? Well, people starved to death in the ancient world. It was very difficult to take food for granted in ancient times, and small Jewish communities often met in people's houses, just like the early churches would. And their worship services ended with an agape, just like those early churches would, everyone eating together. These meals were often likely provided by the residents, and in the days before refrigerators and wealthy nations making huge surpluses of food, it probably would have been most or even all of the food that the person had on hand at the time. In other words, it was a sacrifice. And it doesn't take much imagination to see how this event would have symbolized the meaning that constitutes love, so the highest good, the highest possible state of being, in a worldview that believes in an all-powerful, benevolent God. Like I said, more later, but for now just realize that the Hebrew notion of sacrifice as the highest good found a powerful image in the Greek-speaking world in the meals that they shared at the end of their worship services. And so when they took that word, they were saying, this is what we mean when we say love. Different worldviews, so different ways of looking at the world. Now, the Hebrew scriptures define 4 basic worldviews, the 2 we just talked about, all-powerful and pagan, as well as 2 more, relativism, so the belief that there is no objective truth, and humanism, the belief that humankind possesses intrinsic metaphysical qualities that can substitute themselves for those of a God figure. Like taking ethics and saying, we don't need God to define right and wrong, we can define right and wrong ourselves. We're going to see all 4 of these worldviews symbolized in the book of Revelation, especially humanism. Like I keep saying, I'll explain as we go. But for now, to get an idea of how this stuff looks in communities, let me just point out how Christianity exists in 4 basic forms. And it's not just Christianity. Every major religion in the world does this. All based on which worldview forms the dominant way of looking at the world. Of course, the Hebrew Scriptures teach that only one worldview is correct, the one based on an all-powerful God. And only by looking at it that way can you see the world as it really is, which is why we get the repeated phrase, "Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." They were saying that using a belief in an omnipotent, a being beyond the level of manipulation like pagan deities, was the only firm foundation for understanding the truth of the world. And the mainline Protestant movements of the 20th century, like the ones spurred on by Billy Graham, probably came as close to this as any group in history. Not that they got everything right, they didn't, but they got most, and that's about as good as imperfect humanity has ever done. Interpret those same Hebrew Scriptures with a pagan worldview, and you get Roman Catholicism. Seen through the lens of paganism, God is less than all-powerful, and we can manipulate him by doing things like holding a necklace of wooden beads while we pray. But then we're not thinking much about God anyway, not in this worldview. Mostly we're thinking about his mother and his followers. We pray to them. They're easier to understand and therefore easier to control. The incense, the candles, the emphasis on physical forms of worship, even the sounds we make here. The Roman Catholic Church said its prayers and vespers in Latin long after anyone understood Latin, because in a pagan worldview, power is in the audible sound, the physical, as always, not the meaning of the words being spoken. What about relativism? The belief that truth does not exist? We call that Christian mysticism, and it pops up anytime in Christianity that God is viewed as somehow impersonal. Here, things like ethics start to become arbitrary, unlike with the actual Hebrew teaching, which is never arbitrary. Get somebody who doesn't believe in a completely personal God, like Meister Eckhart here, and you get a vague, mystical, as in mysterious, because it can never be completely understood way of looking at the world. And that just leaves humanism, the face of man on our representative four-faced creature that we'll look at later. What happens when you read the Hebrew Scriptures through the lens of a worldview that says that mankind can replace God? Welcome to the Christian Church of the 21st century. The creator of the universe still exists, but now he's a kind of life coach. Turns out he is for us, which would have been news to the Hebrew leader Joshua, who actually asked that question and got a very different answer. But then Joshua was just a dirty, smelly Israelite, not a special love child of the divine like so many modern Christians now believe they are. What do you get when people think like this? You get the end of the world. I know. I sound like a raving lunatic when I say things like that. I should go put on my sandwich board and shout at the clouds. But honestly, even though we're still in the early stages of this thing, if you don't see the danger as our society is crumbling around us, then I'm sorry, but you're living in a dream world. Remember that passage I couldn't wrap my head around 13 years ago? How would a pagan worldview sit idly by and let a humanist worldview run its kingdom into the ground? By doing things like getting rid of its enforcement wing, the only thing it has to implement its laws? Well, the thing I didn't know at the time was what social media was going to do to our society. How it would replace normal, typical society, the ones based on face-to-face communications with other people, with a society based on trying to show everyone in your echo chamber what a good person you are. Now, you might think I'm just mirroring right-wing talking points, but I promise it is so much worse than that. Watch Tucker Carlson for more than just a few nights, and you'll hear all about how the left is opening the border and changing voting laws in order to take control. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that no one is in control anymore. No one is flying this plane. The border? I promise they would close it if they could. But they can't. Because they can't fathom the idea of being labeled bad people, like what happened to the last administration. And now we find ourselves in the world of the lamb beast, the bizarro world where the person with the best sob story is able to emotionally manipulate everyone around them, all the way up to multinational corporations and even nation states. Much more to come. We'll start in on the movie next time. This is David Reichert from The Bunker. Click like and subscribe and click the notification bell, and we'll try and keep the videos coming. Also, see the link below to order Book 1 of the Holocaust Engine series, our pandemic post-apocalyptic horror that won the Pinnacle Award for the Best Science Fiction Novel of 2020.